We're going to be exploring from beginning to end and the barriers to open research. Sorry, just getting a message that the meeting's being recorded. That's brilliant. So just to warn you, that we are going to be recording the session. So thanks very much for doing that, Rachel. And our programme today, I'm going to start by giving us a brief introduction, a bit of context from the library. Then we're going to be hearing from Professor Hugh Shanahan from Royal Holloway, University of London, and then Dr. Marlene Mengoni from here at University of Leeds. And then we'll have a question and answer session, and we really do welcome your questions and your comments. So please do feel free throughout to post questions in the chat. But we'll come back to these at the Q&A session. And come on the mic as well during the chat if you prefer to do that. That'd be great, but please keep your mics off while people are talking, just so that we can avoid the feedback noise. As I say, we are very pleased today to be welcoming Professor Hugh Shanahan and Dr. Marlene Mengoni. Hugh's Professor of Open Science at Royal Holloway, University of London, with a research background in computational biology. He's co-chair of CODATA, the International Science Council's Committee on Data, and a member of the FAIRsFAIR consortium, and you'll be hearing a lot more about FAIRsFAIR in Hugh's talk. Marlene is a member of the Institute of Medical and Biological Engineering here at the University of Leeds, with a focus on clinical interventions in musculoskeletal tissue biomechanics. Marlene applies a computational engineering approach. And she has done much to embrace open research practices throughout her career, and was in fact one of the very first researchers to deposit data in Research Data Leeds, our own university data repository. So one of our original clients. Whilst Hugh will provide an overview of issues across the sector, Marlene will offer her personal experiences as a Leeds-based researcher. And briefly before they begin, I'll give some context on our incentive for today's topic on addressing the barriers to open research and the infrastructure and systems in place to help overcome some of these. So today's session is the latest in a series of open lunch sessions we've been running this year, following an event entitled Beyond Open Access that we held last October. And coinciding with that first event, we ran a survey, and we were aiming to capture views on open research and to discover whether or not researchers are in favour of and actively engaging with open research practices or not. And the survey was completed by a relatively small number at that point, approximately 50 researchers and support staff, but did represent a range of research positions and levels of experience, from postgraduate researchers to professors. And we asked our respondents if they had engaged in open research practices already as part of their own research activity, what had been their reasons, and the vast majority of the responses outlined positive reasons that encompass both ethical viewpoints, so the idea of working for the greater good of information dissemination, and personal incentives, such as the possibility of increased citations. However, some respondents did flag that their engagement with open research had either been purely or in part to satisfy imposed requirements from the funder or the university. And we also gave our respondents a list of the options shown here, representing potential barriers to open research. And we asked for these to be rated for their importance as perceived barriers. So the suggested barriers covered lack of support from senior researchers, lack of dedicated funding, lack of mandates from funders or other regulators, lack of positive incentives, lack of infrastructure for the likes of data storage, lack of time, and lack of information or training. And the ones receiving the most votes were funding, mandates, incentives, and training. So interestingly, we have both carrot and stick being considered high barriers, with mandates and incentives both being included. Funding is an interesting one too, with some of our respondents commenting on the shift within open access from pay to read to pay to publish, and the different nuance that that brings. And with lack of information and training being in the top 4, this certainly makes us aware in the library of our duty to assist in making information, training and support as available and accessible as we possibly can. So as well as this set of potential barriers that we gave our respondents to rate, we also asked our respondents who had not engaged in open research practices to let us know in their own words what they considered to be the barriers. And many of these did in fact correspond with the suggestions that we had made. So for example, although I'm summarising and paraphrasing here, people mentioned costs or funding, time, lack of awareness or familiarity with open research techniques, so similar to lack of information or training, lack of clarity on the benefits, so again, similar to lack of positive incentives, and as an additional barrier, a concern that the open research movement is an enforced ideology carrying overheads that outweigh the supposed benefits. So there was much for us to take note of here, and we felt it very important to make way for open conversations about the realities of open research and genuine discussions on the benefits and barriers. We also felt it important to enable opportunities to explore the systems and infrastructure in place to support researchers engaging from beginning to end with open research practices, armed with the familiarity and understanding to incur the least possible hassle along the way. So today's discussion is an opportunity to do just that. Hugh will be exploring the infrastructure of the open research landscape and some of the implementation aspects of being open, or more specifically FAIR, which enables open practices. Whilst Marlene will be giving us a personal insight into her experiences of open research in the field. And of course, we very much want to hear your views too. The survey that I mentioned earlier is still open if any of you would like to complete this after today's session. And I think we can put a list of that in chat. And of course, do comment in the chat or come onto the mic in the Q&A to tell us your perspectives. But for now, without further ado, I'm very pleased to welcome our first speaker, Hugh Shanahan, to give his talk. So thank you, Hugh. I'll stop sharing.
Thank you very much, Karen. Let me just give me a moment just to share my screen, or at least the bit where my presentation is. Okay, so first thing first, let's just do a quick sound check. Can everybody? I hope everybody can hear me. Unfortunately, I can't see the chat anymore. So if somebody
we can hear you fine, Hugh.
Okay, that's fantastic. Thank you, Al. Okay, that's great. One quick clarification. I haven't a chair of CODATA. That's several pay grades above my level, but I am a co-chair of something called the CODATA-RDA schools, which is a lot to do about the training side of open science and open research. That always puts a smile on my face, and I could happily, talk for another hour about that. But I'm going to talk about this sort of infrastructure side of things for today. Just to note, Karen, I believe, will be putting into the chat some of the links that are here, including links to the talk, to this talk itself, and so on. And here's my email, and here's my tweety thing if you want to get in touch and you have any follow-up questions. Okay. So briefly, what I want to do is first of all talk a little bit about the idea of openness being a spectrum. Just to note, the term, my term of abuse, professor of open science, I use the term open science because, yeah, I've always been a scientist. I think I understand that what we're talking about here has applications beyond the sciences, but I always kind of want to say, well, I know at least it's already being pretty bossy talking about science itself. It would be very bossy of me to start saying, oh, you digital humanities people should be doing something as well. So I'm aware that there are applications in the broader thing, but I kind of myself just focus in on open science. I want to also spend a bit of time talking about infrastructure, and I'll explain a little bit more what I mean by that, and I'll also explain a little bit about this phrase first-class research object, which actually doesn't really have a published definition as of yet. I'll spend some time also talking about FAIR, findable, accessible, interoperable, reusable, and in particular sort of set its boundaries, what it isn't as much as what it is. My last slide will also point where FAIR is very much focused on data and sharing data. There isn't anything in there that talks about software, and software is as important in this mix. And so just to point out and say there are movements on that as well. So when we talk about openness in research, I think there's one thing it's kind of interesting to see some of the summaries that are there, and this worry about openness, either open research or open science, being an ideology rather than something that's sort of grounded in good reasoning. And sometimes we cannot do ourselves favors by using, ending up using lots of slogans like, open science is open, is just science done right, and things like this. And actually, we shouldn't be trying to shove this stuff down your throats. The important thing, first of all, to say is that, and I'm interested, what Marlene will be saying, is that this is not an either or type of situation. Either you're open or you're not. It's much more about a sliding scale. Think of it as lots of individual steps, which you start out with, I think, thinking about things which are very, very practical and useful, such as, how do I just make the research that I do just be more efficient? And then gradually kind of going through and thinking about effectiveness and so on. And this is, really an important point to note, is that, if I am going to use a metaphor here, if you want a glass of milk, you don't necessarily have to buy the whole cow. All right. And think of that as, okay, I can think about doing this for today and going forward, and maybe not think about other more elaborate schemes later on. The other thing is that, of course, the tendency is, particularly in these, talks, people like me coming along, is to do a lot of talk about the very, very grand vision and so on. And that's very, very, oh, here's the vision and it's all going to be amazing and terribly sexy. But it's as much about thinking about lots of individual small steps and realizing that those things is actually how we, in some respect, we get things done. One thing, relatively small thing done well, which requires still a lot of work, and getting that implemented means that you can do the next thing and the next. I'll use one sort of visual analogy here, is that, quite often people look at, when they're thinking about open science, and I'm particularly also talking about this idea of fairness, people can tend to get very carried away and think about this thing as this huge edifice, this structure, this, really, really beautiful suspension bridge, which carries, tens of thousands of vehicles every day. And it really, really enables transport between two sides, across this river or bay here. And of course, you can say, oh, this is amazing, and we need bridges like this. And if you're kind of focused on that, you can often, if you're in a place where you don't have a bridge at all, you can say, man, this is really hard. And you forget that when you're starting from kind of, oh, excuse me, sorry about that. When we get to, where you don't have a bridge at all, then actually something much more simple and straightforward, a rope bridge, is still a big step forward, and it's really effective for getting people from A to B. All right. And again, I'm always sort of trying to be as pragmatic as possible and say, yeah, open science, open research is about helping people get from A to B. In terms of, there's a growing literature on open science and open research, and this page, it's actually kind of useful to have a little look back and to see where we were a few years ago. So this is an interesting article from 2014, 7 years ago, which is now a very, very long, in open science years, that's a whole heap of time. This paper tries to do a review of what was happening in the literature at that stage back in 2014. And I think it's interesting reading this paper because in some respect, it's actually a paper which is quite skeptical about open science. It sort of says, well, here are all these different ideas that are going on here. And there's this quite cutting remark made at the end of it, which is to say that open science is a lot like electric vehicles. You know, everybody wants them, but everybody wants the other people having electric cars. And so too with open science. Now, it's interesting to note how here we are in 2021, there's a lot more effort going on in open science. And oh yeah, there are lots of electric cars around. Now, to note, the thing I want to sort of focus on here is this really, really interesting idea that came out from the literature, which was to say there are multiple different schools of thought that where people are kind of starting from in terms of how they see open science. So there are people who look at infrastructure and say, well, there are loads of new tools that are out there, and that's the way, and open science is the best way of making the use of them. There's the pragmatic school, which is saying it's about open science is about doing, people working together. There's the democratic school, which would say access to open science is fundamentally unequal, and we need to change that. There's the measurement school, which is saying that the way we measure performance in science is all skewed. And finally, there was what they call the public school, which is to say much of the data and results that's being generated is publicly funded, and we need to make that available. And their idea was to say that people come from all of these different starting points, and they kind of end up in open science. Now, I think it's interesting, here we are 7 years on, and actually to look at that and say, are those still the right schools of thought? And I would say, well, no. For example, there's no mention here of reproducibility, which is a really kind of key point that's there. But the thing also to note is to say that very much people come to open science from different pathways. People come at it from this idea of justice and democracy, for example. And I tend to come from it from the perspective of that sort of infrastructure sort of pathway. And this is very much what I want to focus on here. So at the present moment, what we have is one of the big problems that we're having here, which I think very much intimately relates to this idea of what the worries were in terms of funding and so on, is the perception, the value of your research outputs. And although the situation is changing, we have this situation of the peer-reviewed publication being absolutely everything. It's use this phrase, first-class research object. And my definition that I would use is it's an output that the right researcher should really, really prioritize getting done. And more specifically and prosaically, it's to say it's a research output that you could submit in the ref. And I know we've all gone through the ref at this stage and we should all be ignoring it, but it's worth thinking about. If we look at the ref itself, they talk about research outputs. They don't explicitly talk about publications. But if you look at the ref prior to this one, only 0.02 of the research outputs in the ref, whatever, 2016 or 2015, were software-based. But still, people were saying, no, you can't submit a piece of software. That'll never get through the commission. The panels will never accept that. So the perception is everything, and that's what's leading things on here. But in many respects, this is a thing which can be changed just by thinking about the infrastructure. So if we think about the idea of persistent identifiers, these are things we're very used to. Every paper has a digital object identifier. We now have a situation where people are working on, and indeed have made much progress in terms of building persistent identifiers to cite data. And there are persistent identifiers for citing software and moving that on. And the point is that once this is not trivial, there are working groups on this making lots of progress on it. But once you have that in place, once you have publishers enabling those policies, which is very much about the funders saying you need to enable this, then DOIs for data and software just start appearing in papers. They don't start sitting kind of awkwardly in the text, and they start appearing in bibliographies and so on. And hence, the perception of saying, well, software data is not so important, that melts away. And so let me move on to just talking briefly about FAIR. So for those of you, I'm always kind of aware that some people have heard this 1,000 times before, and then there are some people who've never heard of FAIR at all. FAIR is very, very simply a short summary of the principles about sharing data. And there are 16 principles in total, but they sit into 4 buckets, 4 principles each. So there's 4 about making your data findable. There's 4 about making your data accessible. In other words, findable says, okay, I know where the data is. Accessible is about saying, how to make the data that you can get to the data, or at least the metadata for it. The I stands for interoperable, in terms of, can one machine talk to another machine to get the data transferred across? And the R is reusable. In other words, in particular, setting up the right set of licenses so that people can actually go and reuse the data as they see fit. There's a really nice poster which goes through those points in much more detail that's listed in here. It's important to note what the boundaries are of FAIR, and that's, I think, something that's really, really important to note. Okay, it's as much about saying what it isn't as much as what it is. The first thing to note is that FAIR is a set of principles. They're not standards for enabling data sharing. In other words, it hasn't talked about, it talks about saying you should have persistent identifiers for data, but it doesn't tells you anything about the machinery for doing that. And that's the thing that people are working on. FAIR isn't the same as open science. A team of researchers can have their own FAIR data sets and so on, and then not share it with anybody else, but they work entirely on their own, you know, it's sort of sitting over there. So these are related concepts, but they're not the same. And again, there's a really nice paper from Hickman, Jones, and Bangert describing, kind of teasing out those sorts of issues. FAIR is about sharing data. It doesn't discuss things like the quality of the data, or indeed justice or privacy. These are things which it sort of deliberately puts to one side. Since 2016, since this has been published, this idea got published, standards are coming into place. And I've listed a bunch of a small fraction of the different types of activities to kind of put some actual flesh on the bones that are on these principles. The last thing I would say here is that FAIR is not about building incredibly complicated computational models, data models to express data, particularly on that interoperability issue. And some people do tend to think, yeah, that's the thing that only a computer scientist would love. And you can do a lot with much more kind of down to earth types of things. I've gone a minute and a half over. Let me just finally wrap up and say that correspondingly, so FAIR is always talking about data. It isn't talking about software per se. And at the present moment, there's work in place for building something equivalent for research software, which hopefully will have as much impact as before. Okay, so I've gone 2 minutes over, so I'll wrap up at this point. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hugh. That's great. Marlene, thank you.
Okay, can you all see that?
Yes, we can.
Thanks.
Okay, brilliant, thank you. So I'm Marlene Mengoni, I'm a lecturer in Leeds. And I fell, I'm going to say, into open research, open science during my PhD. I really much managed to complete my PhD only because others were sharing their data openly. But then also I did my PhD at the University of Leeds, and the open access mandate for research evaluation is often referred to as the Liège model. It was sort of initiated in Liège about at the time when I started my PhD. So the open access idea was very much embedded into me growing as a researcher. And what I found recently is that there's a lot about talking of research culture and how research culture can impact on a load of things, including open science. And with that, I was reflecting on, actually, I find that trying to do open research can impact on all of those aspects of research culture. And that's how I'm going to try and frame what I'm talking about today. And so obviously, I'm going to try and address that from the barriers point of view. So as a researcher, what do you see as a barrier, and how do you overcome that by actually just changing the culture around you a bit? It's purely a personal experience. It's definitely not exhaustive. There's plenty of things that can be improved in what I'm going to mention. But in going through that process, I've had some thinking about how the interaction between open research and research culture can actually be enhanced quite nicely. I'm going to start firstly about sharing data and methods, and as a researcher trying to decide what's useful to share. So in the type of research that I do, so I do some biomechanics of joints is my research, and the type of data that we produce. We work with tissue. So this is a CT scan. So from those tissue, we've got usually very high resolution imaging, some mechanical testing of those bits of tissue, some computational model, and then finally process data that comes from all of that raw data. And you can see that data is in two ways, basically, and it's how much research and how much work is involved in generating the data, and how difficult it is to generate the data. It's not always related. So for instance, creating those micro CT scans doesn't require much research in itself, but if you don't have the specialized equipment or indeed access to the tissue, and when it's cadaveric tissue, accredited lab to do that, then there's no way that you can have that. And in looking at those two ways of how the data is produced, what I find is in mandated open data, what would be shared is the processed data at the end. And I do think that this comes because what's being thinking about is what actually is supporting the research question, this research hypothesis, and therefore how much research has come into producing that data. While if you do start thinking about what value the data has in itself, and so as you mentioned, actually thinking about the data as a primary research outcome, then you start sharing all of those raw data, which is the kind of things that I've pushed quite a lot around me in my institute, and which is now more and more done quite usually in a normal way. In that table, you can see that the sum of the data, which is actually generated mostly through existing know-how or through standard procedures, standard piece of code. And I've found that convincing people to try and share that type of information is very tricky, mostly because this is often considered as the unique selling point of a lab. And if you lose that, you're going to lose every edge that you might have in research. I come to that point a bit later. I've often also found that when you've got mandated open data, such as with the EPSRC funding, for instance, you can end up with relatively poor practice in what is being shared. And so in not only sharing only the process data, but in a figure like this one on the lower left, you would share mean values and the size of the error bars, which is of no use to anyone if you don't even have the data points that are beyond a figure like that. And so the way to think about it, I think, is or you as a person, as a researcher, would reuse your data. So the type of conversation with researchers is simply, if you were to lose your data, how much time and effort would you need to regenerate? Type of question with other PIs is more, what future research would this data be useful for or underpin? But then also, if one of the researchers leaves next week, how long is it going to take for someone else to pick up and be able to carry on their work? And that last point is all about having clear methods and process in place that can be shared easily. And again, coming back almost to the point that you was making, if data methods are research output in themselves, then it comes normal to start sharing those outputs as well. And that can be done, I think, only if all of that process about data is directly integrated into the study process through, if possible, data management plans. I'm a very bad person for that, because all of my data management plan is in my head rather than actually in writing. But embedding the sharing into the study process is key for something to happen. I also think, but I don't have much evidence on that, that the more open the data or the more open the methods, and the less likely the malpractice. And so if we can draw a link almost between open data and methods and research integrity, can drive at least integrity. And similarly, I am convinced that opening know-hows and protocols are actually drivers of collaboration and not inhibitors. And so that fear of losing that unique selling point, I think, is probably a bit misplaced. Second type of barriers I've seen on open data is timing. When do you start sharing this? Basically, the main fear here is, what if someone beats me to publishing if I share my data before I've published about it? And just recently, and I intend to use it as an example in the future, I've got just a counter-example. So 2 years ago, we shared data directly with submission of a paper. That paper was a relatively tough sell. It took quite a long, well, it was submitted 3 times altogether, and then a long revision lag as well. So it took 2 years to be accepted. And during 2 years, that data was available, was shared, but there was no direct communication from us about that data because it wasn't associated with the paper. And no one has used it externally. But what's been very useful is that, well, actually that data has been easy to access by new postgraduate researchers, and it's been even more useful in the past year, where we couldn't just open a drawer, give a hard drive to someone. It's available online, it's easy to access. But then also we've used it with undergrads and MSc dissertation students. And again, it's an easy to access, but then also easy to cite, and some information about the metadata in there. And so it's mostly a win situation internally, and definitely no loss in anyone actually using that data before us publishing with it. I think that in terms of timing, and specifically in engineering and EBS, the main thing to think about is potential IP. And if you don't have any potential IP associated with your data, there's no reason not to share it early. And once again, it all comes to, if there's clear value in terms of a researcher is evaluated with sharing data, then there's no reason not to share early, basically. Just a word on reproducibility. And usually reproducibility study is the first barrier, and the first thing that I hear around me is that, well, there's no reward. And in my field, there's definitely no direct ways in publishing reproducibility studies. And because there's no reward, there's no time for it. So I'm trying to think about reproducibility more as self-reproducibility. And what we've done, and initially not as a reproducibility study, but it's ended up that way, is that in a lot of the work that we do, we need to understand more about the sensitivity of our methods to the outcomes, basically. And we do basic of it in the core of the research, but quite often to have more robust method, it's useful to have more sensitivity analysis, but those quite often can take a lot of time, manual process, and not really much added value from the researcher point of view, so no new learning from a researcher point of view. However, we've got a scheme in the school, which is a brilliant scheme through undergrad summer internship. And so what we've done in the past few years is having a researcher taking the time to prepare a very comprehensive description of their methodology, and then an undergrad student over the summer first reproducing what's been done to make sure that they actually understand the methods and those descriptions are complete, and then doing more and assessing the sensitivity of those methods to the outcome. And while the idea was to add value to the core research, in the process, we go through all of the steps to make sure that the initial research is reproducible, and we check reproducibility. Yeah. And on top of that, we also train a new undergrad student, and quite often all of the process is managed by a postdoc who's got also some new management experience in there. So it's a win-win everywhere, and we've got a clear description of our methods, which are now ready to be shared for anyone to reproduce. I think my almost final point is on recognition, reward, and career path. And I think that it's pretty obvious more and more that actually being able to facilitate open research opens up new types of career, and the more open research is actually mandated, the more new career there is with respect to that. I do also think that in a researcher or academic pathway, being an open research advocate does make a difference. There's a couple of quotes at the bottom of the slides here, which are direct quotes from peer review of grants I've applied to in the past, and being able to demonstrate that advocacy for open research does make a positive impact on a reviewer. And even if it doesn't make a huge impact at the end of the day, on whether the grant is accepted or not, having that positive impact on the reviewer is something not to say no on. And then again, open research values other outputs than papers. And so there's more things to showcase for recognition. And so on the right, on the lower right on this slide, there's the just snapshot of the Celebrate Our Stuff online thing from the university from March. It just says shared research data yields rewards. So it's quite nice to start and see that there is some recognition of that. If you read the small prints, which are very small, I apologize, you actually would see that this recognition is on someone that has used data that has been shared rather than share their own data. But it's a first step. So that difference between research culture and open research, I do think that on the ground, to realize the full potential of open research, you can incrementally change some of the research culture and just normalize the open research by practice, basically. I think that more can be done in connecting reproducibility with integrity, or in the connection between open methods and open data with collaboration ethos, and so in connecting the vocabulary used in open research and that's used in research culture. I do think that having open research advocates on the ground is necessary and is very useful for changes to occur. It does require patience, and it can be a slow and annoying process. And if it's not research advocate on the ground, if you get external advisor that can drive those changes, that can work as well. And I think that reward and recognition of open science or open research are compatible only with evaluation by narrative. And so, one of the first things after the ref submission recently is that, well, for EPS subject, we should do a ref by number, not a ref by narrative. And I think that would be very detrimental in rewards and recognition of open research. And it's important to praise success of open research as much as any other success in research in general. I think that's it. Yes, thank you.
Thank you very much, Marlene, and thanks to both our speakers for those really interesting talks. I'm going to hand over to Nick now, who I think has been collating some questions.
Yeah, sorry, Karen, I was too keen to jump on top of you there. Yeah, no, that's great. Thanks very much. I thought they really complemented each other as well, with a sort of more of a sort of sectoral, infrastructural overview from Hugh, and then a much more personal and localized view from Marlene. So yeah, great. Thank you very much for that. You have actually, we only have one question in the chat, which you have kindly taken to answer quite lengthily in the chat, but I thought that was a really good question about standards of open research like FAIR and how that factors in low-income countries. So I mean, people have probably seen what you've said in there, but I don't know if you want to say any more about that. It's something we've actually discussed recently. I'll post a link in, but colleagues may be aware of Reproducibility, which is a journal club. I think there's colleagues on the call from that. And we did discuss recently a paper by Leslie Chan, which addresses sort of these issues of equality in the developing world. So sorry, Hugh, if you've got anything to say on that.
Yeah, no, so listen, I first want to say thank you, Nazia, for raising this particular point. And I think, again, this very much kind of gets to the nub of that thing where, the danger is you can be so sort of obsessed with the big vision that you're kind of going about really sort of practical issues, such as, if I'm a researcher in Zambia, and where actually I'm probably sort of my university really isn't supporting. It's just kind of like I'm getting my research done with my own funding and stuff, things like that, which happens. What does all this mean, and so on. A few things that we do is number one is thinking about the training angle, which is something we haven't talked about here today, but that's really important. Those, what Marlene was talking about, in terms of sort of small wins, things, just very, very practical things to get done. And, the tools there are all open source and so on. It's just about almost that chunk of training for people to go and run with it and so on. That also comes, and something I haven't talked about here, is also building what we're doing right now, which is building communities of people who share points and say, oh, okay, yeah, this seems to work pretty well for me. Why don't, and somebody else says, yeah, I should use that. Where people support each other and learn from each other is something that's really important, and that applies even more so in the context of low and middle income countries. I've mentioned the CARE principles, which again are worth looking at, which specifically address those issues of justice associated with data. We need to, it's ridiculous, this thing where malaria data sets are being generated in Ghana, and then they end up in the data is being stored and accessed from a lab in Germany. That's got to stop. I think the discussion area about infrastructure costs is actually the common one that sort of everybody is there. So it's not just for low middle income countries. The thing we should be thinking about is saying the bottom line is that in some respects, some funding that we kind of look at that goes specifically just to quote unquote research, i.e. paying for postdocs and stuff like that, a few % of that needs to be actually spent on completing the infrastructures in terms of things like repositories, maintaining standards, all that, if I keep on using that roads and bridges types of analogies, we all want to travel on the roads, we need to pay for the roads, basically. And that, also holds for low middle income countries, and we need to think about ways to support that. So I'm sorry, that's a very, very long and rambling answer, particularly to you, Nazia, but it is a very, very fair and valid point.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. Sorry, Marlene, you were about to speak then, but I don't know if you wanted to maybe add anything from your perspective, a disciplinary perspective on that perspective.
Yeah, I was actually going to say that the only reason that on the ground someone can try and change the culture so that open research becomes normal is because the infrastructure, well, in my experience at least, it's because the infrastructure is in place. And once I've convinced people that sharing data is useful, all they need to do is follow a process with the library, and then everything gets done for them, basically. And without that infrastructure, then it's difficult to also try and push and change the culture around you. And so I understand the sort of the point that Nazia might make in saying that if you don't have that infrastructure, it becomes very difficult. And I think that on the ground, it does take much more time to get through things without the infrastructure.
That's great. Thank you very much. There is another question from Nazia. I'll just do this one from Al Jones first, though. So she's asking again a question to you both. What do you think is an appropriate dissemination route for a relatively raw data set which hasn't been processed, analysed? So I suppose again in the context of the work we've done with you, Marlene, in the past, and we tend to focus on perhaps more processed data toward the end of the life cycle, but in terms of raw data, a journal paper or.
I think that there's no need to disseminate data besides data. So I don't think that having it through as you mentioned, a letter or a note or data in brief adds much value if the data is accessible and findable. So if there is that DOI associated with the data, and if it's is integrated in research databases, then anything else I don't think would add much value. Obviously, that can work if description that comes with the data is comprehensive. If much more needs to be done in terms of the description of the data, then indeed something like data in brief might be useful. But I think that all of that can be integrated with the data and the metadata rather than having another process in terms of the sharing.
I wonder if
I have no idea.
I wonder if I could just put a little bit of context around that. I think in a way you kind of did answer the question insofar as maybe those kind of traditional written routes aren't necessarily that much more productive. But I think the point that you made about it being within some kind of structure where people are already looking for data in that topic area, I think that is going to be the case. Otherwise, you might fall into the position, you know, as you said, with your data packet that you put out for 2 years, and actually without you putting it into a structure or advertising it, people weren't necessarily going to randomly find things. So I think there is that findable aspect. But the context to this actually was really, and I think Marlene will know the paper I'm talking about. In one of the leading journals in our field, we found an article where effectively this article was just saying, look at our new data set. They weren't really drawing conclusions from it. And I was amazed that the journal published it. But actually that shows you a push towards a value for open data, because really these guys were just advertising a big open data set of raw data.
Thank you. Just before I ask you, Hugh, for maybe to comment on that, sort of related to that, I mean, you did both refer to, you know, data being a primary research output in its own right, you know, a first-class citizen, if you like. But we've seen, for example, with EPSRC, you know, there's a really big driver for increased data deposit in STEM generally. And funders are emphasising the link to a published paper and the associated data that underpins that paper. You know, perhaps I think we're guilty of that, if it is a guilty thing in the library as well. I mean, do you think that's a good stepping stone, or are we actually, you know, emphasising that link between a paper and the underlying data actually missing a trick in terms of data for its own sake? If that makes sense.
Yeah. Is it okay if I jump in?
Yeah, thanks, Hugh.
So one of the things I think, first of all, is to say that you see different communities, research communities, reacting in different ways to this. So, for example, in bioinformatics, what's been a quite a long tradition of you know, there's a particular journal which has an annual issue which just talks about data sets and just kind of says that's there. And you see also kind of data journals starting to crop up to sort of say, here's how we describe, much in the same way as there are now quite a few journals which discuss software and sort of say, this is what it does, and so on. I think I think that's fine, though I would tend to say that it's a nice to have, or you know, it's the kind of the icing on the cake, and the cake is really the in some respect the data set. And let's put it this way. So it's worth looking at the Research Data Alliance's data citation recommendations, which is Karen very kindly put the links in there. And you know, it's in part kind of going back to the individual research community and persuading journals and saying, this is how, here's some standards on how, you know, actual standards rather than principles on how we should cite data. I think the thing I kind of want to aim for is that data and software, it just appears in the bibliography like papers, and it's just there. And then, you know, I kind of have to put my hand up and sort of say that over the years, you know, I've been the sort of person who sort of said, yeah, we got all these protein crystal structures and here are all the PDB codes for them, and they got just put in a different place. So all that hard work that all those crystallographers did to do it, you know, they didn't get the recognition. They got put somewhere else rather than where they should have been, which is in the bibliography, and getting credit for what they for the hard work that they did. So I would, you know, that's the thing that I kind of thought, yeah, it should be in the bibliography, and when that happens, then the citation engines pick that up, and people start getting credit for that. And in some respect, the lot, I feel that lots of the hang-ups that people have right now kind of melt away, because then people say, oh, you know, I'm getting promoted because people are saying, hey, you've got lots of citations, you know, because if and I'm going to rant now, if promotion committees are going to be kind of just go and stare at stuff for, you know, for employment, and they're just going to look at that stuff, they deserve all they get, you know? So, but I'll stop ranting.
I don't know if you have anything to add, Marlene.
Yeah, I was going to say, I see that mandated data shared with papers as almost two ways. So locally, I've used that obligation to share data as a driver to do more in terms of sharing data. And that's changing locally the culture to see the data as its own right and sharing as its own right. But I've also seen that mandate leading to relatively poor practice, as I mentioned, where in sharing the data underlying a figure, you would have a spreadsheet with mean values and the size of the error bar, which is like, that's not at all what the idea of sharing data is about. And so there's that almost double-edged in mandating that without having clear information on what the idea was about and what would be expected and what the driver is. That's initially, at least, led to poor practice.
Yeah, okay, thank you. I'm conscious of time. I don't know. I'm not sure if either of you need to shoot off, but I did just want to pick up on a question I've missed a little earlier from 5Mian. I don't know who that is, but just I think perhaps to you, could you mention the small incremental steps you were pointing to, like DOI, etc., towards open science, and maybe say a bit more about that as you referred to in your presentation?
Yeah, sure. I think so. Things to sorry, this becomes a little bit like a shopping list, but you know, Marlene might. I'll let Marlene agree or disagree. So things like saying to yourself, right, I'll start when I have to write a DMP, I don't think of it as a box that has to be ticked, but to say, okay, how do I make the, you know, this is a thing I have to do for a proposal. How do I make that work for me? And thinking about the repository that I'm going to think about. Thinking about file naming conventions. All right, you know, within your lab, say to yourself, right, this is how we're gonna name all our files, and do stuff and stick to that. Thinking about, okay, so that, you know, the name titles are kind of make sense and that they convey information and stuff like that. Stuff like moving on to saying, okay, I'll start applying metadata for the data sets that I have. And yeah, I know that that's a bit more effort, but actually I know that from going from one lab, you know, when a PhD student graduates and moves on, actually it's a bit easier for the next person to pick up from there. To think about, if I'm going to be writing software, then again, use tools like Git and so on to do lots of incremental improvements and actually release your code fairly early so that people can comment on it and, you know, do in push requests and things like this. Think about, you know, again, then making onto the next steps in terms of publishing your data, publishing your code, giving them DOIs, uploading things to Zenodo or Figshare, for example. In other words, the repository that you're going to be using. Encouraging your community, your research community, to say, hey, could we think about having a controlled vocabulary for our area? So in other words, saying, let's have a list of terms, and we say, yeah, we 100%, we all agree that this is what this term means, and sort of putting that down in some sort of ordered fashion. that's the first, that's a kind of, that's a bag of things that I can think of. And, you know, these are, you know, they're by far, they're not in any way, shape or form the only things that have been done. Attending these sessions, because there seems to be loads of things that you can learn here as well. I looked at the reproducibility section, had some great stuff in there, and you know, those are things that are there. So anyway, I've kind of rabbited on, but that's the kind of things that I hope addresses what kind of what you're talking about there.
And I guess it's what you were saying, you know, it's not all or nothing, is it? You know, something's better than nothing, and build up your skill base. I don't know, before we finish, Marlene, if you've got anything to add to that? Or?
Not directly, but indeed to reinforce your point is using what's required not as a ticking box, but as an opportunity to think about what will be done. And yeah, that example of the data management plan is brilliant. It should not be just a ticking box, but actually an actual plan and a thinking opportunity.
Great, thank you very much to you both for spending your lunchtime with us, and to everybody that's joined. I think that was really useful. It has been recorded, and you know, you can revisit. We'll write it up as well on the blog. We'll stick around a few minutes. We'll stop recording in a moment, and if anybody, you know, does want to hang around or ask any questions, I mean, I'll just, before everybody does vanish, I suppose I'll just put one question, you know, send them on a postcard, is what is the single, you know, is there one thing that we could do as an organisation to promote a culture of openness and collaboration, you know, so for us in the library? So that's a question. If you have got a few minutes, perhaps you could answer that before you disappear, if you can. Otherwise, you know, if anybody's got any thoughts on that, please get in touch. But yeah, thank you very much to you both, and thanks for everyone for coming. Thank you.
So if you're asking for one thing, well, you know, it depends on how cheeky you want me to be.
As cheeky as you like. People are going now. It's just us.
Yeah. So what you're doing right now is, you know, in other words, building a community is really important. That because particularly over the last 2 years, I've spent on so many calls with various different people and organizations, and everybody, you know, I said, hi, I'm Hugh, I'm this, I'm, you know, blah blah blah, I'm part of FAIRsFAIR and so on, and everybody kind of very sheepishly sort of says, well, you know, it's lovely that we have a chance to talk with you, but you know, you have to understand that we're really far behind everyone else. You know, we've only just started in this area, and we're, you know, so just be patient with us. And it's like, say, you know, that Garrison Keillor quote about, you know, the town where every student is above the average. Everybody, this is a situation where everybody thinks that they're below the average, and it's like, no, everybody's new. And it's very much about and people are learning by sharing their experiences and saying, yeah, this works, this doesn't work, you know. Like when FAIR first came on the scene in 2016, it got for a while kind of dominated by people who kind of looked at it as this sort of fast, you know, computer science exercise in knowledge management, and frankly, it almost killed the thing, to be honest. But then people went, oh no, hang on, it's more straightforward than that. And it wasn't until, you know, there were all this lovely bubble was going on of people thinking, oh, I have this lovely theoretical model. It wasn't until it kind of bounced against reality and said, no, not on your Nelly, that then people said, oh, okay, then things sort of calmed down. And I think that's what you're doing here is great. Otherwise, think hard about making the case to senior management to say this pays for itself, and you know, stop nickel and diming, because the pounds are, you're going to your return on investment is considerable here.
Great, thank you very much. You're muted, Karen, if you're trying to speak.
Obviously, that's good advice. Thank you.
Yeah, no, thanks for your time, Hugh.
Yeah.
And there was, I don't know if Nazir is still there. There was one question from Nazir. Yeah, you're quite right, Nazir. And I mean, you know, if I think you're a student here at Leeds, so get in touch with us in the library, and we're developing training around this. And actually, we do tend to find early career researchers, in some cases, who are more engaged with open than, you know, older sort of, you know, the old professor that's done things in a certain way for his entire career. But you're quite right. There is a reluctance perhaps to share data, etc. But again, I suppose I was just going to say, in terms of, you know, this idea that of a first-class research object, you publish your data with a DOI, you've got provenance on it. It's published in the same way as a journal article. So, you know, I think there's a perhaps a lack of awareness around that you can publish data and it clearly belongs to you under whatever license terms, etc. So, was somebody going to say something?
Yeah, I was going just to jump in. And actually, if you do consider your data as a primary outcome, then actually publishing your data is much easier than publishing a journal paper in terms of the process. And so it's a much easier way to have clear outcome from your research. And getting a paper out can take years and sometimes therefore never happens. While if the data has been produced and this doesn't require much more work to be then become a primary outcome. On the
same, I mean, I just where have time, but you're still here, so you could switch yourself off, but you are still here. But I suppose in terms of preprints, I've been interested recently with, you know, obviously there seems to be a growing culture of preprints, especially through COVID. But to my knowledge, at least, people don't tend to publish data with preprints. That seems to be less common. I mean, is that a fundamental issue, do you think, or could that change?
It's a good question. Again, I think it's one of those things where people do stuff because people do stuff rather than sort of going, well, you know, it's almost out of habit to that you get those sorts of practices. I mean, if you upload something to archive or meta-archive or PsycArchive, and so I say, and it's written as a data paper, saying this is a paper and here's the DOI and so on, you know, to explain it. It's a preprint. There's nobody is saying to you, you can't. There's no peer review of that, and so there's nothing to stop you from doing that. Nazia, I would, you know, if you're a PhD student, you know, obviously have the conversation with your supervisor. We're not here to kind of tell you to do stuff that might make your supervisor angry. Okay, just to be absolutely clear. But it's you know, those are. I think it's also, you know, think about your research community and have a look at the journals, just see what people are doing. The next time there's a meeting, a conference going on, oh, good, excellent. So think about you know, the next conference, say, asking to set up a session on openness and saying, well, for our community, what does openness look like, and what's the best way for us to share our data and things like this. You know, you might find that, yeah, I said, you know, the point that Nick was saying is that actually it's the more junior people that are much more onto this than old people like me. Is that, you know, that they could say, hey, okay, this is an angle that we can think about, and you'll find that you'll start thinking about agreed standards for things. That becomes the thing that's there. It's worth keeping an eye. I know, I'm sorry, I'm sounding a bit of a salesman here. Look at the Research Data Alliance, the RDA, and their activities. They may also have some, you know, they have lots of different working groups, and they might have something for your area. I don't know, you know, what's there. And those are things that are that's where I saw that you noted you're discussing PDBs. So obviously within bioinformatics, there's whatever BOSC is. Those folk are very on top of things as well. Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, BOSC, you know, people like Peter Cook and so on, have a look at their activities and so on. So
okay, that's great. Thanks very much. Could probably bring this. I haven't had any lunch yet, in spite of the way this was billed as an open lunch. I don't know, so I'm a bit hungry. But you know, thanks again, Hugh, and no doubt we'll be in touch. With the other thing as well, the data steward thing.
Yeah, that's fine. I haven't put up my signs advertising that yet. So
okay, great. Thanks everybody, and enjoy the rest of your day.
All right, take care. Bye bye.
Bye bye.
Thanks very much, all.
Bye,
Bye.
everyone.